The Age of War Chapter 1 has been out for a little while now, and upon announcement it set high expectations. Today we'll be asking, has it lived up to the hype, as we'll be reviewing The Age of War Chapter 1, looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly to see how this first chapter has performed. Firstly, let's start with the roadmap. Unlike the Age of Sorcery, this age kicked off with the devs showing us a plan of the flagship features coming in Chapter 1, Chapter 2, and Chapter 3. Specifically, the biggest features of this age are coming in Chapter 2 with the Purge revamp and Chapter 3 with Conan's first PvE raid. The reason I think this is important is perspective. The Age of War Chapter 1 is a bit light on features, and I suspect most others would agree. The reason for this, hopefully, is to give extra dev time to QA the much bigger content in Chapter 2 and 3, and to ensure they are as close to perfect as they can be at release. This is something we saw in the Age of Sorcery Chapter 2, which was also fairly feature light. We didn't know it at the time, but of course that was likely to prepare for the new dungeon in Chapter 3. The devs were quite upfront about the content distribution in the Age of War, and I always take transparency as a positive, but it is worth bearing this in mind when considering the wealth of content in this chapter. So, with that, let's jump into the features. The first feature of this chapter is Clan Emblems. Clan identity is something important to many people, and this new edition allows you to create and display emblems to represent your clan. These emblems are made through a new bench, which is pretty easy to use, and the emblems come from the base game, Battle Pass, and the Bazaar. They go on a variety of banners, alongside some shields so far. For a first iteration of this system, it's not too bad. There are limited options currently, but I do expect the repertoire of emblems and backgrounds will continue to expand, though hopefully it does so not only through microtransactions, but also through new base game additions with every chapter. There are a couple of changes I would like, namely being able to disable either the foreground or the background, but overall I think it's a pretty good implementation of an emblem system. For those of you on PC, I've already spotted 1 or 2 emblem mods that add hundreds of new icons, so it does seem the system is pretty good for mod developers and users. Overall, it's a really simple feature, but I'm fairly happy with the emblem system, and I think it's one of those things that will only get better with time. The major new feature that lays the groundwork for Chapter 2 is the inclusion of clan Hoards. This is a new area and mechanic for your clan, where you can gather various treasures from across the exiled lands to accrue a vast hoard of treasure. This is intended to introduce a new gameplay loop that aims to get the player out into the world to explore, fight, and recover treasure. This isn't necessarily in its final form, as it's a foundation mechanic for the Purge revamp coming in Chapter 2, as it seems the amount of treasure you have will directly affect the new Purge coming in that update. In isolation, I like the idea of a treasure hoard. It's not only something to consistently build up, but adds something new for you to include in your base, and it has a degree of long-term satisfaction by watching your collection build and seeing the actual value of your treasure increase. However, without the Purge revamp in place to complete this mechanic, it can feel a bit hollow. That is a consequence of the content distribution I mentioned earlier, but I do understand why that is. Once a new Purge is in next update, I think the treasure hoards will feel a lot more meaningful and well-rounded. There are a few small things I think could improve the treasure hoards, however. Treasure itself is relatively easy to find or farm, and small treasures like the amphora or mini warhorns or coins can be taken back home in your inventory. However, heroic treasures like the Decetto cat or Lemurian statue have to be carried by hand. That's fine, but if you have to walk from Zelhar to your base in the Western Desert, not so much. You can teleport with these treasures, which is good, but I would have liked to have seen a way to move these treasures around on the back of a horse or a rhino. I think that makes more sense, and hits a decent middle ground in terms of the effort to reward ratio. If we're being honest, it's not really going to be fun walking across the entire map, but teleporting is also sometimes impractical. Therefore, transporting them on mounts seems like a good idea, and hopefully it is something we get in the future, especially considering either Chapter 2 or 3 introduces ambush mechanics to these treasures. Overall, treasure hoards are alright. They're not in their fully contextualised form yet, as they'll be the key for the Purge revamp. I think they'll be much better once their coexisting mechanics are introduced in the next chapter. And now we've got the combat rebalance. Full disclosure here, I am a builder and a lore guy. I'm not really an expert in combat, PvE or otherwise. I've dabbled of course, but again, far from an expert. The idea with the combat rebalance is fairly simple. encourage exploration, increase engagement, and improve the flow of combat. They did this by reworking weapon categories, rebalancing stamina costs, and various tweaks to enemy health, damage, and detection radius. There's also changes to how various weapon types work, and of course adjustments to the repair system. We'll start with the stamina changes. In general, almost everything costs more stamina now, but stamina regenerates much faster, and the regen starts near instantly. The idea here was to get more of an ebb and a flow in combat, where you can jump in, get some damage in, back off for a short while for your stamina to regen, and repeat. This is a tried and tested formula in a wide variety of games. In my opinion, I do like this change. I know a lot of people didn't at first, but I do think it's probably for the best. Prior to these changes, you could quite easily spam dagger or katana attacks to an unreasonable degree, and then when you did eventually run out of stamina, it felt like it took ages to come back. It does feel a bit strange not to be able to do a full weapon combo in the early game, especially with heavy weapons, and this change does somewhat necessitate investment in grit, but I do think being able to level up and use your weapon more efficiently does offer a degree of tangible progression. Overall, I kinda like the stamina changes. Now, the weapon category changes. A new non-craftable category named Unique was added to sit between tiers, and legendaries were made entirely non-craftable. Again, I'm really not against this idea as such. More weapon variety is very nice, and bridging between categories with unique weapons is a good idea. Apparently these unique weapons will be better integrated into enemy camp loot in the future, which will incentivise actually going out and tackling camps, which is nice and plays a bit more into the treasure mechanic too. It seems most weapons also do a bit more damage now across the board. Legendaries not being craftable is interesting. I don't mind having all legendaries only drop from enemies and legendary chests. I actually quite like the idea. However, the issue comes with the next point. Overall though, I don't mind the weapon changes, and I think the philosophy behind them is decent. The aforementioned point is the repair changes. Basically, nothing is permanent. Every repair to an item has a chance to incur permanent damage on that item, which will slowly reduce the maximum durability over time until it's so impractical that you have to get another one or just try something new. For craftable things, I don't really mind this. If you know you only like using axes, you can just keep recrafting your axe. However, there are a couple of item types you cannot repair. These are the unique weapons, which again I don't really mind too much, and legendary weapons. Legendaries not being repairable is kind of odd. On one hand, it stops an issue that was really prevalent. Even in my admittedly limited time in survival, I use the same weapon the majority of the time. At level 15 or 20 I pulled a legendary katana, Musashi's Black Blade, and I still use that past level 60. I never really had a reason to try anything else because I like that weapon. That's generally not too healthy when you want to encourage people not only to try different weapons but also to kill bosses that drop legendary weapons. On the other hand, it puts legendaries in a strange place. They are the top of weapons. They generally speaking outperform any category below them, but you can't repair them. That makes me think the idea is that you'd use craftable weapons most of the time, but if you're going into a particularly tough fight, that's where you want to bring out your legendary weapon. However, there aren't really many challenges that I think would incentivise you heavily to use a legendary weapon over a good epic weapon, and frankly, not being able to repair a legendary weapon just doesn't feel good. I think there are probably better ways to handle this. Maybe something could be introduced that is a rare, high-level item that can repair legendaries, or maybe you have to use one legendary to repair another. However, that still doesn't really tackle the incentive issue of using a legendary weapon over a good epic weapon, so it's a complicated topic. The issue of there not really being much incentive to use a legendary is something that I think could be fixed with the Purge revamp and more so the PvE raid in Chapter 3, but we'll have to wait and see how they play out. Overall, I like the idea and philosophy behind the repair changes, but I think the execution doesn't feel too good, and I think there might be a better way to handle it. There was also adjustments to enemy health, damage, and detection radius. Generally speaking, enemies now deal more damage but have less health and incentivise you further into that hit and dip playstyle that the stamina changes try to encourage. The higher enemy damage also increases the degree of difficulty banding you'll find as you travel further north. Wolves in the Highlands will now destroy you if you wander too far north at too low of a level, which I do think is a good way to encourage levelling up, exploring and progressing. You also won't spend 20 minutes cutting down a boss with tons of health. Fights are now shorter but deadlier, which I think is quite good. The AI detection changes are a little strange. Initially I was in favour of these changes, and I am still in favour of the idea, but now I do think they could have possibly been done a bit better. The idea is to make it so there is counterplay to getting mobbed at places like New Azagarth. Previously, if you walk in, you would have been jumped by the entire settlement, and with changes to stamina and enemy damage, death would have come a lot quicker. Now the aim is to make it so that if you move carefully through a camp, you might only pull 2 or 3 enemies at a time, making things safer unless you willingly choose to run deep into the settlement. There was also changes to enemy leashing, meaning that enemies generally won't be willing to chase you as far as they used to. In theory, I like these changes, especially when contextualised with the changes to stamina and enemy damage. However, in practice I don't think these changes quite hit the mark. It's good to be able to slowly work your way through a camp rather than the previous option of pulling 10 enemies at once, but I do think it makes the AI seem kinda dumb. They don't path all too intelligently, and whilst there are some good points to this change, it feels just kind of silly to be cutting down a guy 30 feet away from another guy, staring straight at you, and he just doesn't really care. There's also some really weird times where you'll be fighting a bunch of people and one guy will go, "Well, looks like you've got it handled," and off he'll go. Again, I like the philosophy here, but without more intelligent AI that react accordingly and behave in a smarter way, it kind of makes things feel a bit gamey, which isn't great considering that the devs actively try to avoid that feeling as much as possible. Again, I am no expert on combat. Overall, I do like the idea of these changes, but I think the execution of some aspects is kind of lacking. Not being able to repair legendaries does kinda not feel so great, and the gaminess of the AI changes can really break immersion at times and honestly feel a bit silly. I do think the health, damage and stamina changes are a net positive, but again, some elements of these changes just aren't executed as cleanly as I would like, and I hope future chapters continue to balance these changes out. Next up is the Battle Pass. I have already covered it in detail in a different video linked in the top right, so I will just briefly skim over it now. The Battle Pass isn't quite up to the Age of Sorcery Chapter 3, which I think was the best Battle Pass, but it's far from the worst. I still think it's definitely worth $10, and it includes a bunch of nice things, including some pretty snazzy armour sets. It's a shame there's no building pieces, but overall, fairly good Battle Pass. The Bazaar has actually been a bit better this time around, but still not quite up to scratch. There's been some good bundles. The Aesir Fortification set stands out as probably the best in terms of price and quality, though it does still have 1 or 2 issues. The dungeon set is also fairly good and more flexible than it seems at first, but it is still fairly restrictive and missing some pretty important pieces like stairs considering the price. You've then got some other bundles like the Aesir Smith, which is visually very nice, but the blacksmith bench is tier 1 and thus not really practical when you're ready to move up to tier 2 and tier 3 stations. There's also a few other bundles that haven't quite hit the mark in terms of pricing, but generally speaking the Bazaar has been a little better this time with the flagship bundles of the Aesir Forts and the dungeon set. Overall, yeah, still overpriced, but it does seem like some things were priced a bit fairer than I expected. It's also worth noting the Aesir set was actually held back for bug fixes before it went live, which is something I hope to see more of in the future if it's necessary. Oh boy, and now we get to the bugs. Bugs and issues have been a real problem with this age, especially at the launch. The most notable issue was, of course, the Numidian foundations. To quote from the blog, the devs changed the collision volume of these pieces, which caused items built on top of those foundations from before the update to lose stability. This resulted in a lot of people losing a lot of things and was a very yikes moment. Now, to give the devs some credit, they addressed the issue, apologised and started a 2-week event that would increase the completion rate for the Battle Pass, alongside double resource spawn rates, tripled resource harvest rates, and doubled thrall and pet conversion rates, all on official servers to help people rebuild. I do appreciate the devs taking accountability, but this really shouldn't have happened in the first place. I'm not too sure whether the issue just didn't replicate in testing, or whether testing wasn't sufficient, but it did really sour the launch of the chapter for a lot of people as it affected all platforms. There's also the still present issue of invisible enemies on consoles from what I hear. I'm not really sure what's going on there. I know it's an issue that has cropped up before, and I suspect it's probably tied to the myriad of difficulties that console continues to face, at least partially because of the aging hardware. However, it's a pretty high priority issue in my mind. Invisible enemies have never been fun, especially elephants who can just trample you at a moment's notice. There was also the issue of treasures falling through ceilings or foundations to the ground below. I had this once or twice on my single player server, and I know people reported it quite frequently. I don't recall seeing a follow-up for it, but I haven't heard anyone mention it in a long time, so I think it might have been fixed. Again, I'm really not sure how that wasn't caught in testing. I suppose it's not the end of the world if your base is located in an area where it's very easy for you to delete and replace a foundation or two, and you could grab them through ceilings and foundations if you could see the item, which is good. But on uneven areas, or areas where every bit of stability is important, it's a bit of a nightmare. Overall, I'm really not sure what was going on with this chapter with all the bugs. I appreciate the devs apologising and taking steps to rectify issues, and I do understand why they couldn't do a server rollback or take individual lost item requests, because that would be a nightmare to try and do, but man, these things shouldn't be happening. I get that some bugs will only be caught when you have a larger player base, as some things just can't be caught by a small team of testers, but big issues like these really put people off the game. I'm hoping nothing like this happens with Chapter 2. I think that update is going to be really important for Conan's future, so hopefully the devs will be cracking down on QA for all platforms in the next update, and I'm pretty sure they probably won't let anything like the collision volume issue happen again. The bugs this season really ruined the experience for a lot of people at first, and to be honest, I think they will drag my rating down a good bit. Speaking of which, it's time for the overall rating. This is a really tough chapter to rate. On one hand, there were some good things like clan emblems and the beginnings of the treasure hoard, but other things do really drag this update down. If there's any one thing that does it though, it is the Numidian Foundation bug. Losing resources or even an entire base through no fault of your own really sucks, and I think it was pretty obvious why so many people were so upset about this bug. The devs did offer some decent compensation in my opinion, but again, it really shouldn't have happened in the first place. So, what is my rating for the Age of War Chapter 1? There's some stuff I really like in this update, some stuff I think will be better by Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 when more things build on them, and some stuff that really soured the update overall. All things considered, I'm giving the Age of War Chapter 1 a 4.5 out of 10. The chapter is fairly feature light, but contextualised with what's coming in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, I can give that some leeway. There are a few things that I think might have needed a bit longer in the oven, like some aspects of the combat changes, but I do think they can be adjusted to hit the sweet spot. That being said, I do, again, like the philosophy behind them. The things that do really drag this update down for me are, again, the bugs. Once the Numidian Foundation issue was rectified, things were alright, and had it not happened, I probably would have given this chapter a 6 or a 6.5. However, the scale of that issue, and the invisible enemies issue on console does really sully the experience. That being said, I remain hopeful that Chapter 2 will be a banger of an update. The Purge has needed a rework for a long time, and given how much they've been hyping it up, it could revolutionise the game. I'm hoping that the time saved with this relatively feature-light chapter gives more time to QA and test the new Purge in Chapter 2, though we'll of course have to wait and see if that does prove correct. We don't have too long to wait for Chapter 2, it should be dropping sometime in late September I think, so we'll probably start hearing about a dev stream in late August to early September. I'm very excited for it, and I think if the devs can execute the Purge update correctly, it could restore a lot of the lost faith from the issues with this update. And there we have it, my full review of the Age of War Chapter 1. Feel free to have your say in the comments, let me know if you agree, disagree, or if you have a different perspective on any of the aspects I've mentioned here. Thank you for watching, and of course a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. For more Conan Exiles builds, lore, reviews, and news for the upcoming Age of War Chapter 2, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Again, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.